And so what I think want to do is kind of think about, what work, think back on what we've done, what worked well, and, what kind of things we learned along the way that we would want to take forward in terms of, both for if we just want to do this work again, but just so we kind of think about what those lessons are. And then I want to also share some things from some numbers from the election, and just to so we can kind of see what that looks like, and how that might also adjust for us as we think forward too. Um, and then I'm hoping one of the people, so I reached out to a couple of folks to kind of do some more general overviews of kind of election results, and so maybe one of them will join. Originally I had talked with Dirk, who some of you had seen before, who had come to do a presentation, and then also Ruth Cassidy, who some of you might know also. And so Ruth might try to join. She has a work meeting right now today, and so she might join later. And so we'll see if we can get some of that. I can share some of the information, but I always love for folks who come up with a source of information to share when possible too. And then we can talk about the transition. So if we could just start off maybe with, well, do you all want to hear the numbers first, or do you want to jump into kind of our reflection? I'll let you decide.
Numbers.
Numbers. Okay. All right. Yeah, numbers. Okay. So I was looking specifically, obviously, just trying to look at one of the things was just looking at voter turnout in the areas where we were focused in, and trying to get a sense of kind of if we see some change in that space, and also to recognize kind of whether what those how those trends have been holding, and to think maybe about a little bit more about how we might get into them. So the area, as you all know, that I know the best personally is the city of Ypsilanti, and so just to give a couple of things. So in the city of Ypsilanti, and I'm gonna see if I'm gonna try to screen share from my other device so folks can see this chart, which is from the county website. So for folks who don't know, you can look at all the election results, even broken down by precinct on the county website. And they also have this. So they also have this map where you can see turnout, and then you can kind of see. So if we see over here, yeah. Let me see if I can zoom in if it makes it easier for everyone. And so the deep red are 0 to 50%, and kind of moving up. The big green are 80 to 100%. And so just because this help as we situate within some of the places. So in Ypsilanti, so in this area here, so in Ypsilanti, where we see our deep red spots here, so Ward 1, Precinct 1 is this. I'm trying to, yeah, you can still see that. Okay, good. Is this area here, and this is the south side of Ypsilanti in this area. So this is the area where many of us did some lit drop. And Brian was on the call earlier, but then dropped off, but maybe he'll join again. But so this is the area, the historic South Side, where a large part of the African American population of Ypsilanti lives. And so this was, they had, let's see here, 2,111 registered voters. 997 ballots were cast with a turnout of 47.23%. For that. And then, and so even though that's much lower, it's still not the lowest in the city, but it's much lower than many other parts of the city, as I'll say in a second. But it is about, so precinct 1, it did go up a little bit from 2016. In 2016, it was 44%. So it went up a little bit in that area. But before, the highest, so in 2016, the highest voter turnout percentage was 47%. But this year, so in precinct 2 and precinct 3, they both got over 50% for Ward 1. And so the percentages did shift about 3 percentage points more turnout. And so even though Ward 1 has overall kind of the lowest turnout percentage across the ward, it did all increase this year. So that's something to note. And then we also see these other deep red spots here in Ypsi and the city. And so this is Ward 2, Precinct 4, and Ward 3, Precinct 1, which it does include, it does include areas where there's a lot of rental housing, a lot of student housing is in this area here. And also a lot of the big rental, our big rental properties are in these areas as well. And so, so they have been lower overall. But the thing I just want to note is just as we talked about the different populations to focus on. So thinking about, their student populations, renter population, and low income. So it also tends to be the rental population in Ypsilanti is heavily low income. And it's not typically students who are, kind of being supported as much by by their family members. It's a lot of folks who are kind of supporting themselves. So, and so I think that's something to still keep an eye on in terms of these areas. There's a lot of folks. I know Margaret on a different call was making a really interesting point too. So, and maybe we could talk about this a little bit, but was saying that especially in areas where there might be, a lot of renters that might be transient, like moving in and out, which in Ypsilanti we have a lot of that, especially because of the people get priced out a lot, and and so there's a lot of people who are constantly moving, unfortunately, but that because of that there could be multiple people listed at an address that haven't necessarily been removed from that role because they moved somewhere else, and so sometimes that can make the turnout percentage seem a little off. So maybe, Margaret, I don't know if you want to say anything else about that, but I just wanted to mention that as well as we're talking about areas where there are high rental populations, although I also obviously think that there's also a lot fewer people still turning out in those areas.
Right. If Dirk comes on, he can explain it, what the percentage is. I mean, it's a decent percentage. Because Michigan doesn't remove you from the voter rolls unless you specifically ask to be removed. So unless you move to somewhere else in Michigan, you could be at this apartment in Ypsilanti for decades. So it is a phenomenon, especially wherever there's a college, and then in apartments too. So, right, so that when we get horrified that some district, you know, in the primary or whatever had a 30% turnout, that's really probably closer to, you know, 40%. It's just, so it's still lower, but it's not as horrifying as it sounds.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I want to just kind of mention a couple of other space spots too, because I see some of these same kind of trends. So in Superior Township, over here, where we see our deep red in Superior Township. And so this area, this here, this curve, this is MacArthur Boulevard. And so within this area is where we have Sycamore Meadows, Danbury Green. So some public housing is in here, and some other different, a lot of different kind of apartment complexes in this area. And so for this one, this is in Superior Township Precinct 3. And so they had 2004 registered voters, 1,077 ballots cast, and which was a 53.74 voter turnout in this area, which, and I think it's just, you know, when thinking about some of the surrounding areas. So here in Superior Township, one of the precincts had 82% turnout. The next lowest was 67% turnout. So this area, which is 53%, is still more than 10 percentage points between that and the next lowest area, which is at 67%. And then the last piece is, so in Ypsi Township, where we have a few areas of the lowest turnout areas in Ypsi Township, which is in precinct 4, which is at 57.19%. And so, you know, it's getting closer to 60. So, but just in terms of how it fits within the township, oh no, actually the lowest is 55%. Okay, I have to add that one. And so this is a Willow Run area. And so the Willow Run area is where we kind of see the orange, the Willow Run airports over here. So these communities that are kind of surrounding it are the areas that have the lowest turnout. With that like 57.19. So you can see that here. 58.67. So this is precinct 6. 57.23, which is precinct 7. And then 58.67. So we can see, so in all these areas, there is some increase from the from 2016 as well, which yeah, in terms of turnout, but still, you know, it's still kind of behind some of the surrounding areas. So I'll just take a quick pause just from that and see if people have any questions or want to look at anything in particular.
Oh, go ahead.
This is Tad. I was just going to, I live in Township 6 there, one of those tan wedges, but I think of the 4 of those tan ones, the highest one was West Willow down below there, which is interesting, which maybe had more of an organized community presence than like my neighborhood isn't really organized in any serious way. Well, so actually, so that was 658. What was down there was 58, the bottom one too. So not much difference. I guess it doesn't, not enough to show. I've just, but anyway, just got me thinking about why, all the whys, since it's close to where I live.
Yeah, no, I think that definitely is helpful, and to think about if we know like what kind of organizing was happening in some of the spaces. I mean, in terms of thinking about some of the national numbers, I know that was something that stands out to me, is that some of this, and on the state levels, like where we saw state turnout really increasing, and things changing, the outcomes changing in ways that were maybe unexpected to some people, is that I saw a lot of that coming down to to the organizing, spaces where there was significant organizing of really targeted populations, that there was these big shifts that was happening. So I do think it's important to think about that. And I know, Tad, like as an organizer, just thinking about the power of organizing too, that, it does sometimes matter, right? And especially when it's localized in community. Margaret, were you going to say something too?
Not really, just in terms of general trends where you have home ownership. There tends to be more of a percentage of voting, just because people are generally voting on their property taxes and are engaged in their local government. Whereas if you're just in a town temporarily, you don't necessarily care who the mayor is or whatnot. So that's another.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I think, and I'd have to look at this a little. This is another thing to look at more deeply. That always is interesting to me, of just like recognizing. So there's like the turnout, but then it's also like how much of the ballot are people filling out too, right? In some of these spaces, and so that there's. Yeah, so it's like, are folks really coming out to only vote on, like, because these are obviously presidential years we're looking at. Although we have seen overall increases in turnout, which I think is, in this year, obviously, I think we saw increases in turnout alongside increase in access as well. And recognizing that, significant amounts of people, for example, registered on election day. So like, I think we're seeing some of these increases happening as well along access as well. Anybody else? And I see Ruth was able to join us. And so, hi, Ruth. Welcome.
Hi.
Um,
Yeah, I just had a comment about the conversation here too. I think thinking about how home ownership is correlated with turnout, we can't ignore voter suppression, and that's historical and has a big impact. I mean, people a lot of times don't vote because their family doesn't tend to vote. And that is tied with historical voter suppression and other forms of oppression. Who has access to owning homes? That tends to be more people who haven't been subject to that. So that's something, I wanted to note.
I appreciate that. And if you want to give a couple of, just because I think that, that's the theme that's within some of the things that you've been looking at overall. So if you want to just say hi to everyone, I did let folks know that you might be joining us. And I'm going to share, I'll stop sharing my screen. I just wanted to kind of go through a couple of things to see what the picture looks like locally, which is probably not necessarily a surprise, but if you want to share some things, we're going to talk about some numbers and then kind of do some general reflecting back of our work and, you know, and thinking about how we were focused on that and what we might do. But this is a good time for you to share some of your information.
Oh, okay. Did you want me to share the same thing that I shared on that podcast? Or then I could share the slides that I made. I don't know if that might help.
Yeah, can you share screen or do I need to give you access?
I see. Okay, it looks like I can share my screen. Let me just pull up my thing. Okay, can everybody see? Oops.
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay. Presentation. So I looked at just some of the trends from it's not much of a trend, it's just basically a change from 2016 to 2020. So I presented this for a podcast, so I was talking a little bit about hot takes versus better takes. Biden's popular vote lead is now approaching 6 million. So, I mean, I know like some people were just starting to look at data from the day of the election, which was not very representative, but now Biden is leading by 6 million, and he leads the electoral college vote 306 to 232. And 306 was the same number of votes that Trump won in 2016. So even though Trump lost the popular vote, which leads, another example of why we should abolish the electoral college. So then as far as states that flipped, we have Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Georgia, and Arizona. The latter two were kind of considered more of a surprise if you weren't in those states, basically, or organizing in those states, maybe. So as far as the numbers go, there isn't that much evidence that Biden flipped significant number of Trump voters, but instead the story was all about the turnout, which was up for both Democrats and Republicans, or in terms of Republican and Democratic voters. So the turnout for Biden is approaching 80 million. And this was despite voter suppression efforts, but like Des mentioned earlier, there was, it does seem that the access voting by mail did help, which, especially in Michigan, I think that was a significant factor in increasing turnout. So in 2016, the turnout was about 137 million, and total turnout projected for 2020 was 106, is going to be 160 million, or that's the projection. So whenever people talk about turnout or just the demographics, we shouldn't ignore the changes in the turnout number and only talk about the share of the votes. And that's something that I've seen a theme of in the media. And I also think it's important to account for population changes. Because, like, for example, there's some people talking about Detroit and number of votes going down, but that's not considering that Detroit has lost population from 2016 to 2020. So it's projected that 2020 will have the highest turnout in 120 years. So this just shows the trend. And the estimate from US Elections Project was that close to 67% of the voter eligible population turns out. So, so there's some comparisons showing how the share of the vote changed from 2016 to 2020. Men sort of, I mean, I guess like some might say that it looks like maybe the Democratic candidate narrowed the gap between men. But I think the more interesting conversation is when you break it down by race. So here, my takeaway is still that Trump support is concentrated among white people, both men and women, although the gap is narrower among white women. And there's still, significant Democratic support among Black people and Latino people. So there's also, a lot of talk about breakdown by college degree, which some use as a proxy for working class or not, which I don't necessarily agree with, but that's what some of these are trying to get at. So among white college graduate women, the Democratic candidate tends to lead. But among other categories of white race and degree combined, Trump or the Republicans tend to lead. So this was kind of the highlight of what I want to talk about, because the share of the vote only tells one part of the story. And I think, some of the conversation has been focused on, well, Trump narrowed the gap among Latino and Black and Asian voters, or there's some conversation about that, but that's only part of the context of this data, because the other part is the turnout. So when we look at the votes cast by racial or ethnic group, the turnout among Latino or Latinx was about 63.4%. That's the estimate increase from comparing 2020 numbers to 2016. So that's a huge increase in turnout, and most of that was, against Trump or for Biden, the Democratic candidate. And these are national numbers, so, we don't have breakdowns locally for this kind of thing. And then turnout also increased by quite a bit among Black voters, over 20%. Asian voters had an increase in turnout by close to 17%, while white voters increased by 5.6%. So historically, we have seen turnout is correlated. White voters who have had access to voting for much longer than a lot of these groups, like I know Latino groups, we didn't have the right to vote until just a few decades ago. So people tend to forget some of these things too. We had a very large increase of 63.4% this year. So that's something that I wanted to note. And I recommend watching Juan Gonzalez's episode comments on Democracy Now, because he gets more into detail on that. So for...
Oh, sorry, can I break in for just a second?
Sure.
Is that okay? Can you guys go back to your last slide just a second? Because something that I was just thinking about too that's important, especially as we're talking about like our work here even locally, is just I think it's important to also note that I'm interested to see, like, as things continue to think about, like, when people talk about, like, okay, what was it, like, what drove that turnout, right? What kind of drove people. But one of the things, too, is, like, a lot of times we talk about, like, low information voters and all these different kind of things. But to me, some of these numbers actually show that people were turning out because they actually, like, there's a lot of information in terms of, like, how this election was going to impact their lives in different ways. And people recognizing some of the ties of policy to, again, like things that they saw like happening to them and their families and in their communities. And that, so for a lot of folks that I, know that were turning out or like registering for the first time, that like those were the reasons. It was that they were being driven by very specific kinds of information and very specific kinds of issues too, that were that they saw a direct impact in their life. So I just wanted to say that because I think for us, as we think about, our focus and the work too, I think it's important to think about what are the things, like for the populations that are increasing in turnout, and that for our focus to think about what are those issues that actually, where people are going to say, no, I see that this impacts me. And that it is because of them having that information that is driving that turnout.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, I think that's a big thing, that people want to know how it even matters, because a lot of people just feel like have historically felt like it doesn't matter either way who wins. So I think this election, people really, seem to think about that more. So yeah, I'm Latina, so I did tend to gravitate to more of the conversation about Latinx or Latino voters. And in the media, I felt that there was some, misleading comments about, oh, Trump is swaying more voters, which kind of buries the lead because we tend to have lower turnout numbers. But some of the story is similar for some of the other voters, because similar things were also said about Black voters, trending towards Trump. And it's like he had a small increase in the estimated voter share. And we need to also consider the turnout, which was not in his favor overall. So, yeah, and this is just more particular to that. And then I feel like in the media, there's an overemphasis in those who vote for Trump versus, like what Des was saying, what's motivating people to vote, to come out and vote against him, even some people who have not been engaged before. Like I know voters who leaned more conservative, and then this election were actually like volunteering for the first time to, try to turn out votes for Biden versus Trump. So that's something, I've been thinking about. I don't want to keep talking, but I don't know if there was any more comments or questions.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ruth, just giving like a little bit of a wider perspective on some of these things. And one of the things I really appreciate, so because within this group is that we have talked about voter suppression, and that was one of those things of thinking about what does that look like for us here, recognizing that we're not Georgia, right, and kind of facing those kinds of, extreme suppressive tactics on ongoing, but also recognizing that, as you pointed out, that there are historic barriers that some populations do face, and that's why it's important to think about that overall, and that even here in Washtenaw County, which has general kind of fair turnout and things of that sort, that we want to continually be focused on that and thinking about what the suppression look like here, how do we address that, so that we can get closer to the democracy we all want, right? And so I really appreciate, Ruth, how you kind of really tune into that as well, and seeing what that looks like with the populations that we work with too in the 48198, 48197 zip codes. And that also gets to when you're talking about the some of the like income and education gaps in terms of voting behaviors too, like some of those kind of layer on top of as well when we think about the communities that we're focusing in. So does anybody have any kind of comments or anything back about that as we get ready to talk about our work in general?
This is Tad. I just wanted to respond to something that that Ruth kept coming back to, and you were just talking about the suppression thing. And I guess it's occurring to me, probably not a new idea for me, but I hadn't thought about it in a while, that the same part of the suppression is just not being involved in between elections, not feeling like you belong to the community, and that you feel like you're a part of that. And so when elections come around, a way that comes across is, well, I don't belong to that part of, I don't belong to the electoral part of the community too. And just a reminder to me of just the constant work in between elections too, that is going to pay off in elections, the more that people, and like Des is saying about just the level of information that people have. Some of that isn't just facts. Some of that is the information that you are a part of this community and a valuable part. That information itself, just helps people by the time election comes around.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, I know even like for a local example that I experienced was I do immigrant rights organizing. And the group that I work with should not be getting an email like a month before the election saying, hey, can this immigrant rights organization help with voting, getting out the vote? And I thought that was like, okay, that's way too cutting it close for one. It shouldn't be the first effort a month or 2 months before an election. That should be ongoing. And then it was also like immigrant rights organizations are have been very taxed by this administration. So it's already overburdened, and to be like, well, help us turn out the vote. And it's sort of like, putting them on a spot that they're not necessarily like there needs to be some more thought into that, I felt like.
Yeah, I appreciate that too. I'm just kind of taking, but thinking about one, that when we think about different groups that we want to connect with, that it might not be so much saying, oh, hey, can you do this work, but more being able to be in conversation and in ongoing conversation, right? But that to be able to say like, what can our role be to help support the community, right? And so if you're focusing on, all this really important X, but we have a relationship, so we can help kind of bring this resource into that space, as opposed, and you can help us like know where to go and who to talk to and things of that sort, but not have to have you know, ask for more labor on in that way. So I think that's something that could be interesting for us to think about within this group too, for sure. And then Tad, I think your point about what happens in between, I think is really important. You know, as Ruth showed, like the trend, you know, that there's a, you know, turnout is trending up. And, you know, I think, you know, I have, you know, like some thoughts or ideas about what that looks like. But of course, it can trend back down. And I think when we have something like this, where we have very high turnout, also means there's very, and it's very politicized and very driven in the media, right? So because the election is like also continuing, right? So I think, you know, people are still, there's still all this, so it creates also this big expectation. And to me, the danger is that when we have a lot of focus in this area and then everything turns away, if we continue what has typically happened, which is that, oh, the election's over and then we just go back to regular business and then it's an election again. To me, my concern is that because it's getting so high and there is so much focus, that it could easily just drop. Or people could say, oh, y'all didn't come back to us. You promised us all these things last time. We came out, you know, right? These numbers, like we came out, we did it, we saved America, and America did nothing for us again, right? So that's a concern I have, and what that looks like locally too is important. I mean, especially we know all of the things happening in Michigan in terms of what's happening at our state level, and we know that we're going to have redistricting and how that's going to come into play in 2022. And so the other thing is that recognizing it's not, you know, there's the even in the off year, or not off, I shouldn't say off, in the non-presidential years, so in the midterms, we've also been seeing some increase in turnout. And here in Michigan, we saw that in 2018 as well, that we were seeing like these big turnout coming. And so that's something for us to keep an eye on in terms of what is that work that's happening in between to make sure so that we don't kind of feel that constriction, because we want what we want, right? Is that more and more folks are voting. And so how do we kind of build that? And so I think that that point is really important. That's one of the reasons I didn't want us to think of our work as done now that the election's over, but that there's different work that will happen in terms of continuing to engage people and to do some of that education work too, right? That like, you know, it's like there's both the like, oh, I don't know if I feel connected to this part of the community, but also like, how do I get involved, right? Because if you don't have that history of voting, you don't have that history of how this works, it probably feels even higher of a threshold to try to get involved, right? And especially when it can seem so like personally taxing. So anyway, I think that I just wanted to lift those up. Any other kind of things if we can kind of transition to thinking about as a group, what are some of the things that you know, we felt worked out well for us, or things that were meaningful to you as a member of this group?
I've been doing a lot of talking, but it just occurs to me, and this is my first actual meeting I've been reading about, but haven't been meeting here, but just the intersectionality of this all is so attractive to me, so that when people are trying to, as Des says, try to say, how do I get involved? The more ways to get involved that don't seem like just a silo off to the side, but that people get the sense that when they are involved in any of our efforts, they are part of the same thing in a bigger way, and that they get that impression, you know, early and often that these other things going on over here, but they're a part of what you're a part of too, will be just helpful in getting that sense of belonging, that that I am a key part of this community, and I owe it to myself and to my neighbors to be more involved. You know what I mean?
This is Greg. I just thought that the town halls, the multiple town halls that ICPJ and We Rock, the candidate forums, so many online events about candidates and issues were just amazing. Also, the people, several of the people on this call produced some amazing other resources. Ipsy Can I Share had done a great job of providing online resources for voters, as did, I don't know, Sue, how many groups are you involved in? I mean, UAA, League of Women Voters. I mean, there was just some great material out there. And frankly, I was able to share out a lot of that stuff with Poor People's Campaign membership. And I don't know if it helped or it didn't, but just being able to get that stuff out and to share it with others and hope that they would also share that and pass that along with people that they know that weren't on our mailing list. It was just so great. The stuff that Circles did about the judicial candidates, the online materials was terrific. I learned some things, even though I think I'm kind of plugged into what's going on. I learned things from many of the resources that were shared through this group, also by some people that were not on this call. And I know I've said this repeatedly, but Desiree and Eleanor just have done some amazing work in many spheres around the election, getting out the vote, organizing folks, organizing groups. Kudos to them and to others with ICPJ that were involved in that. So I continue to feel somewhat guilty because I probably about 4 or 5 weeks ago already, I kind of disengaged from a lot of the activity other than sharing the information that was being funneled through this group and sharing it out with other Poor People's Campaign members. But kudos to all of you that participated and made all that happen. And yeah, I don't know if we made significant inroads in getting folks out in 48197, 48198, but yeah, should probably take credit for even those small and incremental increases. Thank you.
This is Audrey. Our work isn't done yet. And one thing I would like to see a little more involvement is in the battleground states. And what's going on in Georgia right now is another piece of the puzzle to look at the bigger picture. Our work isn't done.
Yeah, thanks for that, Audrey. Just like quickly to say, no, I appreciate that too. And maybe we can come back to that later in terms of thinking about, if there's a role for us to play in that, what that might look like. One of the things is originally, I think that there are possibly some things that we could do as a group and organizing folks to do. One of the things that we would just need to be careful about, although again, in Georgia, we know that there's very clearly, we know voter suppression is a thing there. So so it's not a question of that, but for us just to be careful that we don't wind up in that space of, because that so much of the focus is on these Senate races because of turning the to flip the Senate, which just organizationally we have to kind of be careful about that line of being like, okay, we need this person to win, which I know a lot of focus is on these certain candidates, and so but there might still be something that we could do that's more focused on the suppression piece, and especially because I mean, a lot of this, not so much our work started, but we did do a showing of suppression twice, which was looking very specifically at the race in Georgia when Stacey Abrams ran for governor. And so I could see there could be a connection that people might have too. Might be some interest there. So great for that. Sue, it looked like you were wanting this.
I was just going to say there's a lot of, I loved the way, like Greg said, that the group was able to bring in it was a great coalition, and we were able to bring in all the resources. So if I didn't know something, somebody else did, or I loved what what Joni and Carrie Hatcher-Kay brought to the group. And well, I just really liked the coalition, and it's really interesting where the group started in March and where we ended up, I mean, you're a great leader, Des. There's some things that we'll never know if we had an impact on. For example, the recruiting of poll workers. I think that was a great success. And it not just because of us, but we tapped into a lot of different efforts and assisted those efforts. The safety of the elections, the protect the vote. I don't think that our letter to Larry Kastenbaum made that much of a difference, but I feel like a lot of groups contacted our sheriffs and our election workers, or our Larry Kastenbaum and people in those positions. And then they had that town hall, which I thought was good. And I feel like they made a presence at a lot of the polls. I felt like where I was working as a poll greeter, the police, the firefighters hung out for 4 hours just to be there. And you saw the sheriff circling around, and what's his face? Ed showed up to make sure, how's everything going? I saw Donald Lisinski. I just felt like, I'm sure that I feel like we were a piece to that, in that we contributed to letting it be known that we were very concerned about safety and suppression at the polls. There's a number of things like that I think we had a small impact on, but we really won't know the measure of it, Yeah, okay, that's all I'm going to say.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good point. I wrote that down. I'm writing this down as both a plus and a delta, which is kind of like that, we can feel we had an impact, although, because we were, I think, being plugged into some of the right areas, right? Like the kind of, and also thinking about like, what does, like, if measurement is important, what does that look like, right? And how would we do some of that? I would also say, even with that letter to Larry, to your point, I think that there could be some things, and some people were kind of focused on that a little bit more because we were sharing some of that, but also because we took that through the Washtenaw Action Council, which was organizing and part of these state tables, that also became a resource then, because even though they had been talking about wanting to do something like that, because we already had that, we were already doing it. They then had, we were able to then share that, and we were the first ones in the state to have something like that could go to a clerk, because we were already, that was already kind of in process. And so it helped us to actually be prepared in that way, and that other folks could have used that as a resource too. So I just want to name that too. So yeah. Other pluses and deltas.
Well, I agree with Audrey that indeed our work is not done, and I don't know going forward how it fits for this group, but certainly at the national level, we see already the Biden administration, bringing people into the administration that are classic neoliberals with, corporate ties, corporate interests. More of the same. Perhaps not to the extent that the Trump administration is, but that the battles will continue. We see that the Trump administration is still working and manipulating its evil The New York Times headline that I saw flash right before I came on this call, but I didn't want to get to it to read it, is that the Supreme Court is going to take up the question that the Trump administration is putting forward about not counting immigrants in the census. So that's, that's another issue that's coming up. And certainly our own state House and Senate remain pretty firmly in control, with some small changes in control by the Republicans going forward. So those challenges will remain. I mean, so yeah, the work's not done. It's just perhaps not quite on the same level of severity as we've seen or experienced during the Trump 4 years. But yeah, lots to do, lots to focus on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would definitely say to keep an eye on the nonpartisan redistricting, because I just saw recently, I think it was last week or so, that they are considering director positions. So they're interviewing candidates for that. One of the candidates that made it to finalist is a very partisan Republican leaning person who's been in elected office in a nonpartisan mayor position, but always supports Republicans. And that would be someone they're considering for the director role. So, something that I did was to write saying I opposed that person for that position, and that they're partisan, that they should not be, since they've historically been such a partisan, they should not be leading that redistricting commission, because it's supposed to be very much nonpartisan redrawing of the lines. But yeah.
Yeah, no, I just make that as like a note of something that we might look at, something to keep track of, that we might kind of put as a thing that will be our focus too, because that's going to impact so many things. It's going to impact, like kind of who's representing where, and even maybe how many representatives we have, and some different things. So I can see that being something we might want to keep track on. Hi, Barb. Did you come off because you want to say something? Yeah.
I'm sorry I couldn't be here sooner, but you may have talked about this, but I have a question. Last Monday, I was in and out the last 3 hours of comments. I was there for the first hour, but of the rest, I was in and out. And I heard it, I think 6 U of M legal students described the same activity at TCF. And it was very bothersome, because I hear it happening in Georgia Recount as well, which is a seemingly GOP-driven challenge every vote. And when the U of M students that spoke last Monday talked about having been at TCF and having a woman say, when they said to challenge has to have cause, they said, I don't care about the law. The party has told us to challenge every vote. Is there any statewide through Nestle or follow through on some of the intimidation and bullying, which I've read about may well inhibit voting in the future, just because, or poll working, because of this kind of bullying is the only word for it. And it very much disturbed me. I wrote to 3 different entities, the editor of Michigan Daily and Debbie Dingle and so forth, ACLU. But is there any word on that? Because I find things often that happen and then, oh, they're over, and oh, we won, and oh, great. But no, I really feel strongly about the need to go back and make people accountable, especially if there was systemic or party-driven direction to that kind of behavior, because it can only inhibit it next time if it's made accountable this time. So that's my kind of question and query, because I think that's just shouldn't allow to just stand.
Well, so coincidentally, right about this time, I believe, or maybe it's tomorrow, the Republicans are holding a hearing in the state legislature, I think the Senate Oversight Committee, about what went wrong in the election, about all the fraud and all that, and but they are also controlling who the witnesses are. So it'll be a lot of theater about how, and these false allegations of, counting boards not letting them observe and all that sort of stuff. They're going to be brought up again. And so, a lot of it is just a battle of noise. They're making their noise, and that at every opportunity, counter noise needs to be made. And I think we fall into a trap too, where if we are upset when there is confusion, and processes in counting votes and stuff are a mess. And Detroit's been a mess. I've been there, for a few elections. And we don't want to get back into this corner of defending all of our election processes as it having been perfect, or having been, better. They were better than ever. But, it's just so funny how the Republicans and the other side will take our position when it suits them, and like there is difficulty with our election processes. They're underfunded. Talk about doing things in between elections, basically it goes away, and then all the clerks scramble for the couple months before the election. So to get involved in that would be to get involved with the Michigan legislative action, and to see what bills are coming up. For example, there was the bill that was before the election, which was to allow pre-processing of absentee ballots, and that the Republicans gave in, a quarter of an inch. They let the envelopes be opened, right? 7 hours before election day started. Well, now all of a sudden the Republicans, because they don't like the way it shook out, Shirkey, the leader of the Senate, is saying we should allow full pre-processing of ballots, of mail-in ballots before the election, so we can be like Florida, so we can know our results faster. So there's a lot of room, and I think to answer your question, Barbara, that it comes from following the legislature, and writing to our state senators and our House reps. And of course, in Washtenaw County, we've got Yusuf and we've got Jeff, who are already, obviously on our side, but they are promoting some bills. I don't know that they're theirs, but so that would be the way to engage. And potentially you could invite Jeff to one of these meetings to discuss how we could partner with the legislature to move forward on some of that stuff.
Yeah, thanks for that. And appreciate what you're lifting up, Barb. Being like sometimes these things happen and we're like, okay, let's just move on. But really this is a process question too, right? Both in terms of for people, like if we want to, for poll workers, right? So this election, so many people came out because it was like so highlight that this is going to be a big issue. But if you have a really negative experience, you feel unsafe, right? Like, is that going to make you do that again? And also, I think that we just need to always be prepared, like that in 4 years, if we thought this was intense, in 4 years, it's going to be. I just want to start getting people tuned into the fact that in 4 years, this is going to be a whole new thing, brand new, and it's gonna be intense. Like I fully believe that for the presidential race, that we are going to face like something that's probably going to be on the same par, but with totally new people, you know, like, because it doesn't seem like we're going to have an incumbent. So it's going to be like an open seat. And so who knows? So I think that it is important for us to think about some of that. And I would also say, even in 2 years, right, when we have, that this is something that we might have to look at the midterms in a different way as well. So that's something I would like this, like as a group, for us to keep our eyes on, as a long-term organizing group, that we have to think about that. And so some of the things that it might look like is, now that we have a better understanding of all these different roles, because I mean, to be honest, like all these roles that came up, it's like, oh, I'm a watcher, I'm a worker, I'm a this, I'm a that, and like who you sign up with through those things. That maybe we could have some time in this in between time to better understand that and understand what that looks like, and those roles, and then where some of these different fallings are. But then if there's ways to push, so like as you're saying, I sent letters to these different folks. If there's places that we want to say, no, we don't want this to just disappear, because we think this is part of a bigger issue that we need to get ahead of, right? So we can think about what that might look like, and seeing if there's ways to, get other folks to write letters, or, what that ask might look like. And so we would have to really, I think, dial into that. And then I also appreciate what Margaret's saying too, in terms of, because we, when that legislation was coming up about the ballot, we did share that out and had some folks to try to connect around that. And it's great that now the time, things that have shifted and changed, right? So now this seems like a great idea to process these absentee ballots, right? And so being able to keep an eye on some of those things, I think, alongside is good, and to think that what's going to happen in this in between time when people aren't focused on it. So I like that idea. I took that note. I see Tad has his hand up.
Yeah, just another thought about the future here that I might be, others probably thinking about it too, but just the connection between, we talked about state politics, but also national things. If it happens that it's possible for there to be some major positive things happening on coronavirus or infrastructure or other kind of economic kind of issues at the national level, I'm hoping we can all be thinking about how might that apply to local Washtenaw County issues, that we can, take the popularity of some of that motion and say, here's how that, how that applies, how that will happen, how that will work locally, how, we, and how specifically some local decision makers we could start, engaging them on, if this happens, how is this new influx of money or whatever, might happen locally. All of it aimed at finding local issues that people can grab a hold of and that we can work on together as, the best way to get people involved is to have an exciting, meaningful, issues that have a local handle. And I don't know what those are going to be, but I think if we just stay open to that kind of thinking, we might be ready to work together on, okay, good, that's happening nationally. People are, how do they apply that locally?
Yeah, I think
shortly here too, but thank you all for.
Yeah. Thank you. I know we're going to be coming to a close soon too, but I appreciate that a lot. I mean, I think, for ICPJ, our focus is, acting locally too. And so I really appreciate what you're saying. And I'm just going to kind of throw a little kind of thing on top of that too. So 100%, like thinking about what things are happening at the state and federal level that we want to kind of bring down or make look like this is what this looks like locally. I love it. I think that makes total sense. The other thing that I was hoping, and one of the things for this group that is talking about some of the accountability work, is also being able to track some things and or putting seeds for certain policies that we want to move locally that can also go back up too. Like if I think there's that both things. And that part of that is understanding our local governance structures, and having folks in some of those spaces, and recognizing. And so also the other thing for ICPJ too is that we're really focusing in, really focusing in on racial and economic justice, and having that really be our launch pad for our focus, and especially as we think about like policy, and different things of that sort. And so being able to kind of track some of those things, or like understand like what kind of policies in these different areas that we might focus on, and how we might be able to track how they might move, and around, so right within the county, we have all these different local, the cities, the townships, and sometimes they share information, sometimes they don't, they can learn from each other, but we could still see how things might move in different ways too, which is part of, maybe trying to address some things, but also a way of maybe engage different people in this process in different ways, based on these different areas of work. So one of the things that I am hoping that there will be some interest in among the larger group is to do where we might either identify, a couple of offices in particular that we might want to watch or keep track of, or be specifically issue, and we might want to figure out where's the best place to work through that issue. That we might have something where, as an example, Ypsilanti Township, Superior Township, trustees, this came up in a different meeting I was in. People were like, well, what are those meetings even like? What do they even do? Who's going there? Do they have an audience at all? What are those decisions? But that we might say, oh, you know what, we really want to, because of, our focus area, like we might say like Superior Township, we have some folks who would like to start going to those meetings. And so we can help think about those resources and say, okay, we have some folks that are going to the meetings and then sharing notes. So we can start seeing what that looks like. We might have some folks, so, because we did the forum on the county prosecutors race as an example, that we want to focus on, well, what's happening in the county prosecutor's office? Are they, is Ellie like holding true to the things that he put forward? What does that look like? And so how are we tracking that? So I'm hoping that there might be some interest to, we don't have to decide what those races are now, or offices are, but I'm hoping we might be able to do some of that too, because then we can also kind of focus in on a couple of spaces and kind of see how, and kind of build from there based on people, like who's interested, in doing some of that and doing some of that ongoing work. And then that will also probably, hopefully lift up then some focuses, like what we might need to focus on as well. Any other ideas? I know we're kind of a minute away. Ideas of kind of future directions, or things that we might want to address. And then I'll just say one last word about kind of how that might look. Or I guess another question I have is also, so we were doing, we started off kind of meeting less often when we were meeting in person, and then we moved to meeting, and so then we started meeting weekly, which, and so I'm also interested in thinking about what that might look like too, if people have any thoughts about that.
Well, only thoughts might be, Des, as you look at attendance, because you have a better view of that. There's been, in my shorter observation, a real ebb and flow to both size and the membership, some overlap. But yeah, I think that analysis would be really helpful to making a decision of both frequency, length, person, all of the permutations.
Do you think a survey would help?
Yeah, I mean, we could do, I mean, I'm not sure how folks, will answer, but what we could do, so we did have, I know I've shared out a couple of times, and so what will likely happen, so I know I've been sending out these emails to like this big group that, which had people who kind of have come on at different times, right? So as Barb was saying, there's been different folk groups of, different folks who've kind of joined at different times. And so now I had folks sign up to join kind of a Google group. So I'll start a Google group that will be our ongoing. So I will stop using that other email, like kind of general email moving forward. This was kind of the last meeting, I think, to kind of tie that up. And then we'll start the Google group. And maybe within that, we could say, kind of put out a little survey. And maybe I could also, before we have folks kind of identify like where their interest areas were. And we didn't wind up, we kind of did that and we were going to break up, but then I remember it was like, it just didn't work out because in the next meetings, it was a much smaller group. And then it kind of, started that ebb and flow. So like after we had designated, it didn't make sense to break out.
Right.
But for this, maybe I could do, some of these ideas that came up today, some things that we've been thinking about, and what, like, even just our direct work, what that would look like to change, and then have folks to identify that. And so I can send that out through the Google group. That seems like a good next step. And that also can have something around meeting, like, because I also think too, Barb, too, part of the thing is like this meeting time, it kind of came, I mean, it wasn't like it wasn't like, oh, like we figured out the best time for folks. It was kind of like, there was like a time that worked out. We did that maybe once and it worked out. And then it was just like, oh, we're going to move to weekly. We're just going to keep it at the same time. Like it was, and then it was like whoever could come. And we've had people who, have been, I think, really keeping track. And like I said, I get emails from folks too. I had some folks who, they just couldn't because of work stuff, but like they still stay tuned through the emails. And so I know that there is some of that. So we might also think about, there might be another time that might work better or something like that. And so I can add in that, do a survey around kind of areas of work interest. Like here are some things that we came up with, meeting time and frequency. And then also, I think the other thing to think about too will be how the meetings will be facilitated and like how that will look. So what I'll say is, so this kind of, I kind of like was like really facilitating and leading on. But what I would love is that this group would become more kind of shift into more of like a ICPJ caucus group, which is, I obviously just personally still want to be involved in all of that. But as a caucus, and we'll be having more information about what that will look like that I'll definitely share with the group too. But, the caucus would also be a little bit more like self-led in different ways. It might have rotating facilitator and some different things like that, as opposed to it being totally like driven by, by staff. And so I know that would be a change for this group, but I'm hoping just in general that this might be a process for ways that we can help birth caucuses, is where we would have a collaborative action campaign where we're really focused in, bring folks together so everyone gets to know each other, build relationships, we could do some work together. And that then once that like campaign time is over, that it might be able to transition into a more ongoing caucus that might focus on some of that continuing work. And so I'm hoping that this might be a way. So really, we're kind of testing out this movement in terms of kind of how we might have things, be able to move into these ongoing organizing caucus groups. And so we'll see how that works. Anything, how does that sound good to folks? Anything else before we jump? Great.
Are you from Stacey Abrams' playbook on the caucus?
Wait, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Are you pulling from Stacey Abrams' playbook on the caucus idea? I like it. I just am wondering, having seen the chat and you've read her book, and I'm just curious.
Oh yeah, Ruth shared that. I copy and pasted that, and I mean, definitely a fan of Stacey Abrams and think that she's like brilliant, but I haven't actually read her playbook, and so yeah, I typically just I'm like, oh, this sounds like a good idea, and then other people are like, no, Desiree, there's actually a lot of things that say this is the best way. So yeah.
Okay, thanks. I was just thinking you may want to have, like the first and third Monday of a month be an evening meeting, and then the second and fourth be a midday, depending on the way your survey goes and when people can come and whatnot. But that's a nice ebb and flow, or it could also be matched with tasks if you focus on certain tasks. First and third be this task at night, and the other be the other task, or the other focus, I should say, that day. Lots of ways to do those meetings.
I know, but that's good to think about, like how we can do some of that variation and what that might look like.
Yeah, just leaves it a lot more open.
And then also how we share information in between meetings, and like if people can only come, like how that looks too, I think will be important. So we can still work through some of that, and the group will determine, I think, what works best for itself.
Yeah.
So thanks, everyone. This is great. This is helpful. Some feedback. So definitely, if you have other feedback or anything, you can feel free to send it along, so we can kind of roll it up as we kind of, for the year. I'm going next week, and for the rest of December, don't try to get me to do something. No, I'll be really focusing in, but really wanting to think about some of these things on like a bigger level, and think about like what, because I know I have some reflections too, just in terms of, like what might have been more helpful for the group, or how can we even keep track of all of our resources. So we do have a folder where a lot of things we've been storing a lot of information there, and Vina actually also helped kind of like collect everything to a lot of the resources into a space. And so we'll be kind of thinking about that, and then also think about how to make sure we share it ongoing on our website too. So this has been great, and thanks for coming.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Ruth.
Thank you.
Joining
Thank you all.
to share, and I hope we're able to have you connect with us more too, because I think you have a lot to share too, of course.
Great.
And
I said, yeah, it was great.
yay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So yeah,
Thanks so
I'll
much.
see you all
Have a great
soon.
Sunday.
I'm getting some information if you've all signed up.
Put me on the list.
All right.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.